So if we want to find a dinosaur, where do we look? I think there's sometimes a misconception out there that we sort of walk out into the Badlands and just start digging. But we actually are a lot more calculated than that. If you think of all of the famous places to find dinosaurs, whether it's Montana or Alberta, Mongolia, Africa, the places that are rich in dinosaurs have three ingredients, and they have to have all of these criteria in order to find dinosaurs there. It's kind of like baking bread, where you need yeast, flour, and water. If you're missing one of those ingredients, your bread doesn't bake. And in this case, it's the same for finding a dinosaur. You need all of these three ingredients in order to find a dinosaur fossil. I'll preface this, though, is that first, the rocks that you're looking at that contain the fossils have to be when non-avian dinosaurs were living. That's in the Mesozoic era, and that's in either the Triassic, Jurassic, or Cretaceous periods between about 230 and 65 million years ago. That is the time period the rocks need to be in order to find a dinosaur. And they have to be the right environment as well, with very few oddball exceptions. Dinosaurs lived on land, generally not in the sea, and therefore you need to have rocks that represent terrestrial environments. These are deposits that were formed in lakes, rivers, or sand dune type environments in order to find dinosaur bones. So if you have the rocks of the right age, the right environment, you need to have these three ingredients to find a dinosaur. One is that the area had to represent a good place to live for a dinosaur. So if we're taking Alberta or Montana as an example, the rocks that are exposed in the Badlands there are from the end of the age of dinosaurs. The richest rocks are about 80 to 66 million years ago. And back at that time, North America was bisected by a seaway that stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. Global temperatures were much, much warmer than they are today. There were no ice caps. And basically, Alberta and Montana and Utah and New Mexico and so on were where they were basically beachfront property, or just beautiful, lush, subtropical, to temperate places to live, lots of vegetation, a great place to live if you were a dinosaur. And dinosaurs were very abundant in these coastal regions at the time. These places also had to be a good place to become a fossil when the dinosaurs were living and dying there. And this means they had to be places of active sedimentation. Remember, in order to become a fossil, these skeletons have to be buried quickly in order for the fossilization process to start, because the fossils are preserved by minerals being carried through the groundwater through sediments with bones that are buried in them. So it has to be an area of active sedimentation. And about 75 million years ago in Alberta or Montana, you had the Rockies, the young Rockies just starting to form, and you had rivers that were running from the west, coming off these newly forming Rocky Mountains, and running eastwards into this shallow, warm inland sea. And with it, sediments were eroding off the mountain range, being carried in these rivers. The floodplains were crisscrossed by braided and meandering river channels that were heavy with sediment, and that sediment could bury any dinosaurs that died near these river systems. So it was a good place to become a fossil. These areas were also subject to coastal flooding, and this is an important way that sediment is carried and deposited. To just give you an idea of just like burying a big dinosaur definitely requires a lot of sediment. And this is an example of just how one of these coastal floods can dump a whole bunch of sediment at once, enough to bury a dinosaur. This is a few years ago, the Mississippi flooded. And this is a shot of after the floodwaters receded. The sediment that was being carried in those floodwaters was dumped out. And you can see there's the mud that was dumped out onto the floodplain. The mud that was dumped up onto the floodplain is axle deep in this Volkswagen. So you could definitely bury large dinosaur bones or even most of a skeleton in some of these flooding events. If dinosaurs happen to die near a river system or were washed in by a flooding event, sand is carried in the bottom of river channels, which could slowly bury an entire skeleton. So you could have a fossil of a dinosaur in rock, but if that rock is not exposed at the surface today for us to find, we'll never find it. And so this is why these places that are rich in dinosaur bones are good places to become fossils, because those rocks that are rich in the fossils are exposed at the surface and actively eroding today. Badlands, like you're familiar with from Alberta, like this picture from Dinosaur Park, or Montana, are excellent places to find dinosaurs. They erode so fast that vegetation doesn't stick, and that means the fossils that are hidden in the rocks are exposed at the surface for us to find during prospecting. Some areas that you might not expect to be good places to find dinosaurs can actually be quite good. This is a shot from an expedition to the Arctic that I joined back in 2003. And this is obviously the worst case scenario for finding fossils. My tent is the one on the far right. We woke up numerous times to snow. Why this is bad is because the snow is blanketing the ground. You can't see any fossil fragments eroding out of the rocks. You can't see the rocks. This is basically nightmare scenario. But the Arctic has very little vegetation, and the permafrost with the freeze and thaw actively erodes rocks quite rapidly. And so in the summers, when the snow melts, we actually get a huge amount of beautiful rock outcrop. And the Arctic, on the Canadian side anyways, is actually there's quite a large area of rocks from the Mesozoic. And because of climate change, the field seasons are getting longer and longer up there. So I'm going to predict that we're going to see some really a big pickup in significant finds in the Arctic. And while we were out there, we did find quite a few bones. And so you can all the areas have to do is have those three ingredients, and they can be good places to find dinosaurs. So yeah, it'd be a good place to live if you're a dinosaur. High fossilization potential back when the dinosaurs were living and dying. And then those rocks with the fossils in them have to be exposed today for us to search and find dinosaurs. So Abby, I'm not seeing any chat questions. I think it's a good place to just ask if there's any questions.
Yeah, there were a few. You can't see your chat box?
Yeah, I can't see the top. I'm not sure why.
Let's see. Let me try and resend them one more time, but if not, I can just ask them verbally.
So I can hop on here.
Can you see it now?
Yeah, actually, I think it might be better. If you want to ask those to me, I'll just share my screen, and then I can answer some of the questions.
Sure, I'll go through some of them in order. So Ben had asked, what is the best find you have had, what is the best find you have had while working in the field?
For me, that's an easy one. I actually was lucky enough to find the oldest dinosaur nest in South Africa. That's about just a little shy of 200 million years old. And from finding that first complete dinosaur nest, that led us to find the right search image for finding nests. And we actually, in a short period of time, found another 13 nests in a very small area, and that became the oldest known dinosaur nesting site. And that was published in Proceeding the National Academy of Sciences and was just a huge, huge thrill for me. So hands down, finding the oldest dinosaur nesting site is top of my list.
Wow. Yeah, and then we had one that was asking, where is the best place on Earth to find well-preserved dinosaur fossils?
I don't think there's a single best place. There are a lot of good places out there. And some of the highlight places that come to my mind are, of course, Dinosaur Provincial Park in Alberta. where 5% of the world's dinosaurs are known from just a few tens of square miles. Montana is a fantastic place to find dinosaurs. The land of T-Rex, just around the Fort Peck area, Garfield County, Montana, superb. Everyone's familiar with the dinosaur fossils from there. Dinosaur National Monument in Utah preserves Jurassic dinosaurs at an incredible abundance. And then there's some far-flung places which are famous in my field, like the Gobi Desert of Mongolia, where Velociraptor is from. Another place would be the Liaoning fossil beds, the lake beds that are producing all these marvelous feathered dinosaurs. I would say that those are sort of some of the top places in the world to find dinosaurs.
And do you know if any raptors could ever fly? Because I know that you said that their bones were similar to our birds.
That's actually an area of active research. It looks like Velociraptor and Echiraptor and Deinonychus, they're too big to fly, but we think that they had wings. In fact, Velociraptor, there's a specimen that actually has quill knobs running down its forearm, which suggests it had big flight feathers that were anchored to its arm. And if you look at sort of their evolutionary history, their basically ancestors or close cousins had wings, definitely had wings on their arms, actually had wings on their legs, which is wild. These are animals like Microraptor and Sinornithosaurus, and then a little further out, animals like Anchiornis and Archaeopteryx. It looks like basically the ancestors of the sort of big fierce raptors that we know could at least glide and maybe even fly. And so it's been suggested that animals like Deinonychus and Velociraptor and Echiraptor, there's a group there that's secondarily flightless. And it's definitely possible when you're looking at the evolution of these like flight-related structures. A good question is, why would they maintain their wings? Well, if you look at ostriches, that's not a bad place to start. Their wings are used for display, to show off to mates. They also use them, I believe, for balance when they're running. But a really good idea came from a scientist out in Montana, a good friend of mine, Dr. Denver Fowler, who suggested that maybe these animals were using their wings like a raptor today, like a hawk, where they jump on top of their prey and they sink their big hook-like can opener claw into something like a baby dinosaur, and then they use those wings to keep their balance. And so this is a behavior that's called mantling, and it could have been a very important stage in the evolution of flight, which Denver called the prey restraint hypothesis. I think it actually makes a lot of sense when you look at the killer claws of those raptors and the fact that they maintain their wings when they get big. So I like that one.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So we have just a few more and then we can move on. But one is, so are paleontologists able to do isotopic composition of fossilized samples to understand what dinosaurs ate?
Yes, yeah, it's actually a area of research that's getting more and more popular. Right now, there's a number of studies that are looking at carbon and oxygen isotopes in dinosaurs to understand where they may have gotten their water sources from, and look at issues like migration, and then as well to look at niche partitioning and where they get their plant matter. So we can look at variation in those isotopes and actually get come to some reasonable conclusions. But people are now looking at even more sort of exotic isotopes like magnesium and calcium to get an even better idea of the sort of trophic pyramid that these dinosaurs occupied. So yeah, it's a relatively young area of research, but you're going to see a lot more of it, and it's a very useful tool for testing these ecological hypotheses.
Yeah, and then we have one that says, how much of paleontology is really just knowing geology?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that if you asked me that question 50 years ago, and I was on Earth, you get a pretty different answer. So the traditional route to going into paleontology was actually through geology. But nowadays, especially in the last 20 years, scientists like myself are actually asking much more biological and evolutionary related questions. So most of the paleontologists that are my generation actually have gone through a biology and evolutionary biology degree to study dinosaurs. So we study them as living animals. And that's a bit different than, sort of the traditional approach. Comparative anatomy was, of course, always an important part of paleontology. But I think we're getting much more biological in our thinking about these animals to understand what they teach us about evolution and the evolution of ecosystems and, of course, extinction. So, yeah, it's sort of half geology and half biology.
Oh, that's cool. And then lastly, we have, while I assume most fossil recovery is done on land, is there any percentage of underwater recovery?
That's a good question. I do know of some expeditions and fieldwork that's done underwater on fossil mammals, basically cave systems that have been filled up with water subsequent to these animals basically living in the cave systems. And I've seen a few documentaries of basically divers going into these cave systems underwater and plucking out amazing fossils. It's pretty rare to look at dinosaurs underwater. I can think of examples where, like, basically sites have been turned into sort of coulees or valleys that have badlands have been turned into basically like reservoirs. And as the water fluctuates, sites sort of are underwater and then are exposed if the water levels are low. But no one really scuba dives for those type of fossils anyways. A good example actually is the nation's T-Rex, the T-Rex that's on display now at the Smithsonian. That was dug up by Jack Horner, the Wanko-Rex. That area where it was found was originally a coulee. They built the Fort Peck Dam. The coulee was flooded as part of that dam project. And that site is actually more or less right on the water level. So when the water level's high, it's underwater. When the water level's low, it's exposed. But no one's digging in those areas when the fossils are underwater.
Great. Well, you can continue, and everybody keep sending in your questions for Dr. Evans.
All right, that was a good place to stop. So now that we've gone out to an area where we know has the potential to find a dinosaur fossil, it has those three ingredients. It's a good place to live, good place to become a fossil, and the rock's the right age and the right type were exposed at the surface. Now I'll take you through step by step how we go about digging up a dinosaur. First of all, you have to find a good skeleton, and this can take a while in even the best places. More articulated or whole dinosaur skeletons have come out of Alberta than just about anywhere in the world, at least big ones. And there was a calculation that was done by Dale Russell that suggested that it would take about 4 months of one person walking the Badlands to find a good articulated skeleton. And that's in one of the best places in the world to find articulated dinosaur skeletons. So it takes a lot to find a good specimen. But once you find it and you decide to dig it up, this is how it works. So here, this is an example that I'm going to use from a duck-billed dinosaur that we found in the Milk River region of southern Alberta, actually just a stone's throw away from the northern border of Montana. This was found by a rancher actually in his ranch dump site, kind of an odd context, but you can find dinosaurs anywhere where the rocks are the right age. And we came and we checked it out, and we thought that it was a good prospect. We could see parts of the upper leg bone and the pelvis and some vertebrae that were sticking out of the rock here. And there wasn't a ton of rock above it, so we decided that we would dig in and see if there was a skull. And so finding it, of course, is pretty exhilarating. Now, how do we get it out of the field? Well, first, The second step after finding it is getting a great crew, because you're going to have to move a lot of rock and you're going to have to lift a lot of heavy plastered field jackets containing heavy fossils. And so you need a great crew. Digging dinosaurs isn't something that you can do alone. This is the crew that I had when we were digging up this specimen 10 years ago. And the next step, when you've got your crew, is this is when the hard work begins. This is where you remove the overburden. So the fossil is actually off just under the lip to the bottom right of the screen. And we had about a meter or so of sandstone above the fossil. And it was quite hard sandstone. So we had to get tools like jackhammers to remove the hard sandstone cap. Depending on how much overburden you need to remove, and how hard or soft the rock is, it depends. The tools that you use are dependent on that. Often we can just use pickaxes and shovels. When the rock's hard, we can use jackhammers. And sometimes when there's a lot of overburden and it's really hard, we can use heavy equipment. To give you an idea of what overburden actually is, you can see the fossil there at the bottom of the screen. The overburden is what we call the unfossiliferous rock, or the unfossiliferous layers that are above the fossil layer of interest where the fossil is coming out. So this here would be the overburden. And it often takes quite a while to get the overburden down for a specimen. We're not always lucky to have the overburden a few inches from the specimen, as in the Jurassic Park scene. Sometimes we have tens of meters or hundreds of feet of overburden, and that can take a long time. As we get closer to the bones, our tools have to get smaller. And when we get down to the bone layer, we have to work with hand tools like hammers and chisels, or even dental picks. And this is where we start the process of carefully uncovering the bones before we remove them. This is very different from how they used to do it in the olden days, where they would uncover the bones relatively quickly and remove them. But we keep the bones in the ground. We take great care on the next step of the process, which is to map the skeletons while they're in place. Skeletons were often removed by the early fossil hunters for the sake of progress, but removing skeletons and removing any bone from the layer that it sits in is actually a destructive process. The reason that's the case is because we're removing it from its geological and stratigraphic context, and we're removing the precise associations of the bones with each other and with other fossils in the deposit as the dinosaur that we're interested in. The rocks themselves also preserve information about the environment that the dinosaur was buried in, and of course, the environment that it probably lived in. And so we spend quite a bit of time in the field very carefully mapping the specimens and preserving that contextual information, because once we remove the bones, most of that information is gone forever. So this is how we do it. We get a meter by meter grid square, and we basically use a plumb bob, and we set up a grid system, and we map every bone in place before we remove it. Once we've done that, we've created our quarry map and taken the orientation information on all the bones. We then start to define the blocks that we want to take out. In this case, you have the entire backbone of this animal running from the top left to the bottom center of the screen. You can almost see the vertebrae there lined up. And we had ribs attached on one side, and you actually see the shoulder blade coming off to the top right of that block. And so rather than break this up and risk damaging the specimen, we decided it was safer to preserve all the bones in place as they were found. So we defined quite a big block that more or less contains the whole front half of a dinosaur. We were hoping that the skull was tucked under the body, which it often is in these duck-billed dinosaur skeletons. We didn't see it in the field, but that's another reason to take a big block, because if the head is tucked underneath the body and we break this up into different blocks, we might actually crack through or cut through the skull, which we definitely did not want to do in this case. So we defined a big block, and then in order to cut around the fossils, we had to start putting on a plaster of Paris and burlap field jacket. This is basically a cast that we make for the bones. And this is a cast just like you would make for a broken arm. You basically take burlap, dip it in plaster, put it around the bones, and that hardens and makes a protective shell that serves the same purpose as a cast on our arm, that keeps all the sort of like broken bits of the bones, which are fragile in the case of fossils, together and in the right order and stable, so that we can transport them out of the field, or in our case, transport our broken arm around while it heals without doing any damage. So once we have that cap on and the block defined, we then start to undercut the blocks. And this is important because we need to free the fossil from the ground. In order to do that, we have to prevent the fossil from falling out of the bottom of one of these big jackets. And so we have to basically make a lip where we continue to grow that plaster cast underneath the fossil so it doesn't fall out. And this can be sometimes a bit of a herring process. You have to be careful because you don't want the pedestal to break while you're chipping away at it, especially on a block this big. The next step, once you've got that sort of that rock and bone mushroom ready to go, is you just plaster, and you plaster. In the case of the bigger the dinosaur, the more plaster you have to put around the bones. For a whole dinosaur like this, we plastered for 5 straight days. That's all we did. Every morning we get to the site at 7:30, we mix bins of plaster, and we cut bandages, and we dip the bandages in the plaster, and we would just put plaster on this block. This is what it looks like when it's all done. The big straight pieces in there are wood that we put in to stabilize the block. There's about 20 layers of burlap and plaster on this block. It is a lot, and that is what gives it the strength to allow us to flip the block over without twisting or damaging or breaking the fossil. And then something like this, you have to pull it out or lift it out with a crane or both. So it has to be really, really strong. We've already spent over a month digging the fossil out of the ground. Who knows how long it took us to find the fossil, and especially if it's something that's significant, in this case, an articulated dinosaur, which is rare. So you want to plaster it more than enough to make sure that you don't do damage at the final stage and you get it back to the lab so you can study it. So this was fun when we were done. Now what do we do? This is a big, big block. When we're excavating bone beds or find isolated specimens, we can make little plaster jackets. The plaster can dry in a couple of hours, and we can basically pop them off, put them in our backpack, or carry them out to the truck, no problem. This obviously is a little bit too big for anyone to carry. So how do we get something the size of a dinosaur out of the ground? Well, it's a real technical challenge, and it's actually one of the funnest parts, where you have to deal with these really challenging big blocks of dinosaur to get them out of the ground. And here is how we got this one out of the ground. First and foremost, you've got to flip that block over, and so that you can basically free the fossil from the ground and then start sliding it to where it goes. We decided what we would do is we would, in this case, we needed heavy equipment. So in Alberta, we have lots of friends with big trucks who love to do this kind of thing. And so we called our friend with a big truck. You can see this is lifted with the big mud tires. This is actually Wendy Sloboda's husband, and he was very excited to use his winches. And we thought that this would be a piece of cake for a big custom truck like this. Well, when we started to flip the block, you'll see what happened here. Before we flipped the block, though, we knew that we were a few hundred meters into the Badlands. We couldn't get a crane or any heavy equipment to the site itself. So we knew we were going to have to pull the block some distance to get it to where we could actually put it on the back of a truck. And so in order to make the sliding part actually more efficient, we actually cut the top off of a 1930s Roadster, which was in the very dump that the dinosaur was found in, literally with a grinder. We cut the roof off an old car, and we stuck it on here, strapped it to the fossil. When we flip the block over, break the pedestal and flip it over, it'll be sitting in this sled. So this is kind of like a stone boat. And one of the secrets to removing big jackets with fossils that paleontologists have that you might know is we use car hoods or the tops of cars, because they actually are really nice and slippery, and they allow us to pull the specimens out of the Badlands with relative ease. And if we're going to put it on a stone boat or just pull it with the plaster bottom. So it's a neat piece of engineering, and it worked well in this case, but for one hitch. So here's how the flip went. And this is where we hold our breath, because this is the sort of do or die moment. This is the most anxious moment of any dinosaur dig. When you flip a big block, you're worried that the center of that block is going to fall out and the fossil is going to be damaged or ruined. In this case, the flip went over absolutely perfectly. It fell into the roof of the car. We had everything chained up. Everything was good to go. So we were happy. We breathed a big sigh of relief, because this is a very big block. So then our friend with the big truck tried to pull the jacket out of the quarry. And this is where things got a bit hairy. He tried to pull the block with his winch, and instead of the block coming up the hill, when he engaged the winch and started to pull it, it actually started to pull the truck towards the block. So he's like, okay, well, I can solve this problem. I have a winch on the front of my truck too. So he tied the front winch to a giant boulder, engaged the front winch, and he thought that would give it a little bit of bite, so that we would get the block moving. He engaged the back winch, and rather than that block moving, his truck just raised off the ground. And at that point, he said, I'm done here. This is my baby, my pickup truck. I am not pulling it apart for a dinosaur. And of course, this was the second last day of the field season. And we thought, well, how are we going to get this thing out of here? We have 24 hours, and we don't have a truck big enough. It's too big for even the biggest trucks of our most country friends. So we thought we were going to have to leave this, put a tarp over it, leave it, and figure it out next year. And the next morning, we started to break camp, and we got lucky. There was a new oil rig going in, and they had these gigantic rig trucks that they with winches that basically pull on and off like giant Atco trailers. And we went to the site where they were drilling, and we asked if anybody at the site was interested in helping us with one of their gigantic rig trucks. And lucky for us, we got there just in time. The crew had just dropped off all of their rig gear, and they were about to head home. And a couple of them, actually Swedish brothers who were truck drivers, they were really excited by this. And the foreman said, yeah, you can go and help them. You're doing what? Digging up a dinosaur? Yeah, sounds cool. So they came out with their truck, and they flipped the jacket up over, and we got to pulling it out. But you'll see why we had problems. So this is a picture of the jacket after we just pulled it out of the hole. This is me right there. Does anyone want to guess how big this is? How heavy this is? We way underestimated. So this jacket turned out to weigh 6,000 pounds. So how much does 6,000 pounds? Well, that's about as much as a mid-size or a large car. It's about the size of a full-grown Indian elephant. So this is a very big challenge to get out of the field. And lucky for us, this rig crew had these monster trucks with winch cable the thickness of my arm, and they could easily pull this block out. They loved the challenge, and there was two of them, the two brothers, who were basically competing, and this was amazing to watch. We had one truck with a winch engaged on one side, one truck with a winch engaged on the other side, and we could basically like guide it one way or another through the Badlands. And with a truck this big, it was actually pretty easy to get the blocks out. And lo and behold, on the very last day of our field season, we hit step 10, which is celebrate when you get that block out of the ground, ready to transport back to the museum. So we had a very happy crew. Took us about 6 weeks from start of the dig to the finish. And then came and actually, believe it or not, even bigger job. We had to get this fossil back to the lab and start cleaning it up. So the fossil was so huge, we actually had to get a special crane to lift the block onto a flatbed truck. And then we sent it on its 3,000 or 4,000 mile journey back to Toronto. And this is actually where, believe it or not, the real work begins. And I think a lot of people don't know the magic that's worked in the labs. It takes about, as I said, about 6 weeks or so to dig up a whole dinosaur about the size of a Triceratops or a T-Rex or a duckbill like this one. But it usually takes somewhere between a year and 5 years for somebody working on that specimen every single day in the lab to clean the fossils up, stabilize them, and get to the point where we could study them and put them on display. So that's a real bottleneck in paleontological research, is actually getting the fossils cleaned. And so this is a job, it's of unsung heroes of paleontology, I would say. The technicians in the lab, we could not do our work without these extremely patient and skilled people working day in and day out, taking basically the grains of sand away from the bone one at a time. It's really incredible. And so my hat's off to all my techs. They work wonders. So the first thing we do when we get the cast back, this block was so big it wouldn't fit in the museum, so we had to take it to an off-site storage facility. When the jackets are small, we use actually cast cutters, like from a hospital that we'd use on a broken arm, to open up the jackets and start working on the fossils inside. But in this case, we actually had to use reciprocating saws and grinders to get through that thick layer of plaster. And you can see here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's the 20 layers or so of plaster jacket on this fossil. So that alone took an entire week just to cut the plaster jacket off the top. And then the hard work began, starting to uncover the fossil. And this is where things got actually a lot more exciting than we ever anticipated. So the rock turned out to be relatively soft. This was good. And this is technician Amelia, who is an absolute pro preparator. She's using here what we call a micro jack. It's a pneumatic tool. It's like a miniature jackhammer that's used to prepare specimens. Once you get right down to the surface, you're often taking the rock away with a needle mounted in a handle. But these little jackhammers really help, especially remove some of the bulk sediment as you're getting down to the fossil, because remember, it's upside down. And I'll remember getting updates from her saying, yeah, things are going well. And then she's like, I've hit a really weird layer here. Just above the bones, it's all wrinkly. So I left it on the skeleton. I don't quite know what to make of it, but it looks like something interesting. And I took one look at it and I realized it was the skin of this dinosaur. So you can see here the scales. And this is actually part of a frill down the back right here, like an iguana has. So this turned out to be a really special specimen. Not only did we have all the bones, many of the bones in place, but we also had the skin preserved, which is ultra rare. And this is another reason why it was really good to take out such a big block. We didn't break up any of the skin on the fossil. And this allowed us to get this massive continuous piece of skin over the entire back and one side of the dinosaur. So it turned out to be really an incredible specimen. Sadly, the skull wasn't preserved. So we basically just had sort of from the hips to the middle of the neck. But, you know, given that we had such a huge area of skin, we'll take it. This is a very special specimen and is something that one of our undergrad students is currently working on, and it's something that'll make a great display in the museum one day. So a very cool specimen. And that's sort of one of the types of surprises that you can get when you're careful in excavating your dinosaurs. So after a number of years of work, that's where you eventually get your whole dinosaurs that you can mount in a museum and study. So as I said, a typical dinosaur will take about 1 to 5 years to prep in the lab, depending on how complete it is and the hardness of the rock versus the hardness of the bone and the separation. And then it usually takes a couple of months to mount the dinosaur. So if you look at a dinosaur in a museum now, hopefully you'll have a new appreciation for all of the hard work that's gone into it. Any dinosaur skeleton that you see, like this duckbill dinosaur, you're looking at really a minimum of 3 or 4 years of work to get it to the point that you can look at it. And if you go to a place like the American Museum of Natural History, where they have 40 dinosaur skeletons, that's a huge amount of work. Literally hundreds of years of work that's gone into getting those displays ready for the public and getting those specimens ready to study. So dinosaurs are big. They take big effort, but in the end, of course, the effort is worth it for everyone. So that's how you dig up a dinosaur. Happy to answer more of your questions. And if you want to learn more about how to dig up a dinosaur, I'm not sure why that's animating that way. As Abby said, you could check out the History Channel series, Dino Hunt, on Netflix. It's on Netflix USA, so you should be able to find it. And that actually tells a story about how we dug up this amazing horned dinosaur, Wendyceratops. And if you happen to be in Toronto, the Wendyceratops dig, you want overburden, 100 feet of overburden. It took us 3 field seasons to just dig the hill back. So it was a bit of a gamble. We didn't know what would be inside, and lucky we had over 250 bones of an amazing brand new species of horned dinosaur. But man, that was a lot of work. And if you're interested in learning more about how we dig up dinosaurs and go about preparing them and naming them, we have an exhibit that was part of the launch of the TV show, which was very cool to work on Wendyceratops at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. If you want to learn more about the process, you could see some of the real bones of Wendyceratops as well. And if you're up in Toronto and you come to the ROM, you can see our amazing dinosaur galleries. We've been collecting dinosaurs for 100 years, and we have over 30 on display. One of the biggest collections of dinosaurs anywhere in the world, and one of the biggest galleries full of dinosaurs anywhere. We actually have more dinosaurs on display than the Smithsonian. So if you're up in Canada and in my neck of the woods, come and visit the ROM, say hi to Wendyceratops, and see our incredible dinosaur galleries. So dinosaurs, I said, take a lot of work, and I showed you an example here that was from my field work, a number of examples. And I do have to, before I end this, say special thanks to all of our field crews, volunteers, the students. You cannot be an island digging up dinosaurs and studying dinosaurs. Getting them out of the ground, getting them prepared takes so much work from so many people at all levels, from paleontology enthusiasts and volunteers to the students who dedicate their time to digging things up, and the technicians, of course, for prepping it. So I've got a shout out to all my field crew students and staff and volunteers for all their hard work on all these dinosaurs I've worked on over the years. Couldn't have done it without them. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Yeah, we can go ahead and wrap up with these last few questions. So we had one that said, what is the biggest mistake you've made or could have made when uncovering a fossil?
The biggest mistake, I could give you the biggest mistake, and almost every dinosaur worker who has done a lot of field work like I have, it's where when you flip the jacket, the bottom falls out. That's the biggest mistake that we typically make. And that's, of course, disheartening because you spent weeks digging up the fossil and documenting the context of that fossil. And you're also excited about it. And if that happens to you, it's heartbreaking. And every major paleontologist, all the famous ones that I grew up with as a kid, and I know they've all had bad flips. And I'm not going to name all their bad flips, but I know helicopter lifts where it was windy and the helicopters, the load started swinging and they had to drop it. And the dinosaur just basically turned to powder. That's an extreme example. I do know blocks that have flipped badly and damaged the fossils inside. But I also know that as long as they pick up all the pieces, these fossils can often go back together. And I know one particular example of a turtle where the bottom fell out of the jacket and it was in 1,000 pieces, and they got it back to the lab. The skull was still good, and they gave it to volunteers, and they put it all back together, and the fossil's great. It's still a great specimen. I had a bad flip on a big Triceratops block once. It actually wasn't the flip that was the problem. I had the pedestal break, and the block slide off, and that was weird. It was a weird situation. Definitely learned a lot from it. But yeah, no, we've all made those mistakes. So I would say that that's the biggest mistake that typically happens, is that where you're basically defining the pedestal and trying to flip the block over. It's always very tricky.
And then how do you get the electricity for your power tools out to your really remote site?
Great question. We actually use generators. So we use gas powered generators to power our tools, and they work great. So we rarely need, those sort of like cartoon gigantic jackhammers that are gas powered. Those are super easy because you can just fill them with gas, but they're actually really hard to handle. And the jackhammers we typically use, that most of my colleagues use as well, are electric jackhammers. They're nice and light. You can actually like hold them upside down, and you can actually have a lot of control of where that tip is. And those are powered off of just like a reasonably sort of a medium-sized gas-powered generator. And so we just honestly we put it on a sled, like a sled that you basically like toboggan on, and then we drag it out into wherever we're going. Sometimes a few miles, and then we just bring in gas every few days, and no problem.
And this was just one that I was wondering: is how much of your lab budget do you think you spend on plaster?
Thank goodness plaster is cheap. But when we're doing big digs, a lot. I mean, it wouldn't be unusual. We'll be out for something like 6 weeks. So that would be a typical sort of dinosaur dig in the American or Canadian West. We probably spend about $500 a year on plaster alone.
Wow. Yep. And then does skin fossilize the same way as bones do? And when you have skin preserved on a dinosaur, do you separate the skin from the bone for display?
Good questions. We're learning right now a lot about how skin preserves. And what we're learning is really surprising. Oftentimes, historically, up until relatively recently, the skin, like you saw on the dinosaur today, was thought of to basically be an impression that's left in the rock, except under exceptional circumstances. In the case of this particular dinosaur that I showed, it is indeed an impression. But we are learning that a lot of these skin fossils that had been assumed to just be impressions might actually be the skin fossilized at some level. And there's been some studies relatively recently that have looked at the biomolecular composition of those fossils and looked at the chemistry, and they've suggested that at least some of the original keratin is preserved. So like the scales and the scaly skin of a dinosaur is made of keratin. And for Zool, it is a fantastically preserved specimen. There is no doubt that the skin is fossilized. The question is, how is it fossilized? And is any of those original biomolecules, any of the original keratin, does it survive in a state that we can actually study it from an evolutionary point of view? How modified is it? And can we extract some actual original biomolecular information from it? This is super exciting, and I think is going to be possible. Yeah, so you can actually get the skin preserving like bones. That we know now.
What is the benefit of continuing to dig up and research dinosaurs? What lessons can we learn from the dinosaurs and apply to them to our life now in modern ecology?
Oof, wow. Modern ecology. So you can actually go a lot. There's a lot we can learn from dinosaurs. So if we just want to understand biology at the extremes, I mean, dinosaurs are the biggest terrestrial animals that have ever evolved. And I think that we can take a lot of lessons there as to how big things could get, why things got so big, why mammals are much smaller, in fact, than most of the largest dinosaurs. And those are perspectives that the fossil record has given us that we wouldn't have even asked the questions without dinosaurs. I think ecologically, dinosaurs, of course, were around on this earth for about 150 million years, the non-avian ones anyways. And so they're extremely successful. I mean, mammals as the dominant large-bodied animals in terrestrial ecosystems on land have only been in that role for about 60 million years. And dinosaurs and mammals originated at the same time in the early Triassic. And dinosaurs are the ones that took over, not mammals. And what gave mammals their shot is a major mass extinction event that occurred at the end of the Cretaceous period. And many of you may have heard that we're in a period of biological crisis today. We're in an extinction crisis that has been termed the sixth extinction. What that refers to is the next sequence in the number of major mass extinctions. These are like Earth's greatest ecological catastrophes, where over 75% of species on the planet went extinct in a geological instant. We only know Earth has been through those crises because of studying the fossil record. And the extinction that killed the dinosaurs is the most recent of those big 5 mass extinction events. And so just because the way the fossil record works, the further you go back in time, the less quality data you have, the less fossils, the less rocks that you have to study the environment, and the less individual animals you have to study the ecology as a general rule. So if we want to really understand the causes and consequences of mass extinctions, the effect of decimating our ecosystems to the level that it looks like we are precipitating, and how those ecosystems can recover or restructure, studying the extinction that killed the dinosaurs is exceptionally important because it's so data rich. And so that, I think, is one of the biggest contributions of studying dinosaurs, is studying that transition from a dinosaur-dominated world to a mammal-dominated world. What factors were involved, what survived and what didn't, what factors are associated with species survival, which can help inform our conservation decisions today. Of course, not all dinosaurs went extinct. The small feathery flying ones, the birds, survived, so they're still with us today. But there's obviously an extinction filter right there that can teach us about some of the qualities that in the face of major cataclysms or ecological collapse, what types of vertebrates on land are favored. And then I think what's really important too is understanding the long-term consequences of what we're doing to the planet. So a good example, you might have heard, if you've read about the sixth extinction, and this is pretty sad, that we might be, that the 21st century might be the last century of mammalian megafauna. So this is, elephants and rhinos and hippos in the wild, but megafauna also includes things like bears in North America, or moose, or bison, or these types of animals. So megafauna is it has a pretty broad definition, just basic, animals that are essentially larger than people. They tend to be the most vulnerable because they have the lowest populations, have the biggest ranges, and need the most resources to survive. But what impacts is our decimation of some of these most iconic and important animals. What's the impact that would have? What consequences that have? Well, we can look at the age of dinosaurs. How long did it take for body sizes in these niches to recover after the dinosaurs went extinct? And it's surprising. There's been a couple of studies on mammal body size evolution, how long it took to reach the sizes that dinosaurs had achieved, and also what we see today in modern ecosystems. It took about 5 to 10 million years for animals to reach the sizes that we see them today. That means we're having geological and evolutionary consequences on these ecosystems. Once we decimate those megafauna, even if we disappeared in an instant, it would take millions of years for animals that size to evolve again. So I think those type of perspectives are very humbling, and hopefully they're motivating for us to stop some of our bad behavior and conserve some of these amazing animals.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll leave off with this final little thought and question.
All right.
What drew you to dinosaurs in the first place? And have you ever thought about working on fossils of other reptile groups like snakes?
Oh, people ask me that question actually quite a bit, like, why did you study dinosaurs? And for me, it was just like never a conscious decision. I like decided I wanted, my grandma brought me a book from the Museum of Natural History in London when I was about 3 years old. And my uncle took me to actually the Royal Ontario Museum to see dinosaur skeletons for the first time when I was 4. And I just never looked back. I never even thought about it. It was just like my entire life was dedicated to dinosaurs. I was just read about them and dreamt of being a paleontologist my whole life. So it wasn't a conscious decision. It was kind of like, I was always what I felt I had to do. So I never thought about it. But what I do like about studying dinosaurs and being a paleontologist is my job is literally to discover new things about the history of life on Earth, whether it's new species of dinosaurs or new insights into their anatomy or evolutionary ecology, which is really exciting, that we didn't know before. And then to teach people at all levels, from the public to university students, about why the past is important, and to use dinosaurs as sort of iconic examples to teach people about important things like evolution and extinction. And it's an awesome part of my job. And so it's like I never really go to work. I'm still that 5-year-old kid, and I get to do all this cool stuff with dinosaurs and hopefully make a little bit of a difference in the world out there. Snakes are cool too. I got friends who study snakes, and it is very cool. Big evolutionary mystery there as to the origin of snakes and where they came from within lizards and so on. Cool story. You learn a lot about evolution. Super successful group, but I'll stick with dinosaurs.
And I lied. I do have one more question because I need you to help me settle an argument. Do you have an opinion if dinosaurs were warm-blooded or cold-blooded?
There's a lot of work that's been done on that, and we can say for certain that most modern birds are warm-blooded and they're living dinosaurs. So we know that that's part of their physiological repertoire. Dinosaurs are a huge, huge group, and they're extremely diverse. They have a huge range of body sizes. There are lineages that have very, very different ecologies. They lived in all sorts of different places. Even though there weren't ice caps in the age of dinosaurs, there were dinosaurs living in the Arctic year-round, where you would have no sunlight for a good chunk of the year, and they lived, all the way, through the equator. So we would expect that dinosaurs would probably actually, given all of those factors, that they gave rise to birds, which are advanced in that respect. They came from, relatively physiologically less sophisticated animals. That there's probably a lot of variation in the physiology of dinosaurs, and that's sort of my stance. And there's been a number of people who've also argued for that in different ways. And so, yeah, I think some dinosaurs were probably warm-blooded or very close. Whereas the other ones, like the big sauropods, their problem would have been dumping heat, not maintaining a constant body temperature, because they're so big, their thermal inertia would have actually hindered them. So it could have been actually a disadvantage for them to be warm-blooded. And there's some evidence of that. Another interesting thing is we can look at the growth of dinosaurs, and we know that they all grew fast, like much faster than a typical reptile. So it suggests that their thermal physiology is probably a cut above a typical crocodilian or a lizard. So it's somewhere in that range. So it's probably quite variable.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone who joined and sent in your questions. David, thank you so much for spending your morning with us. This was a really
awesome. Yeah, thanks to everybody for listening in and asking questions.
Yeah, all right. Well, we will be back. Well, actually, we have an Ask a Scientist tonight. We have our first happy hour Ask a Scientist tonight at 7. We're going to be talking about immunology. And then next week, we will be talking about chemical engineering. So I hope to see you all then. And thank you again.